nationale suisse, Monsieur le Président de l'École polytechnique fédérale de Lausanne, Madame la secrétaire d'État aux questions financières internationales, Mesdames et Messieurs les ambassadeurs, chers collègues, chers amis. Bienvenue à la 5e édition du Private Banking Days, une manifestation organisée conjointement par l'Association de banques privées suisses et l'Association de banques suisses de gestion. Au vu des contraintes sanitaires qui prévalent encore, nous avons dû renoncer à tous vous accueillir à la Maison de la Paix à Genève. Vous êtes ainsi nombreux à nous suivre par visioconférence et je vous informe que celle-ci sera enregistrée et mise à disposition sur les sites de nos deux associations. Pour ceux qui auraient voulu nous rejoindre dans ce magnifique bâtiment, vous pourrez vous rattraper en venant ici le 29 novembre prochain pour le Building Bridges Summit et les événements qui le suivront. Aujourd'hui, nous sommes réunis justement pour parler de finances durables. L'association Swiss Sustainable Finance vient de publier son étude de marché annuelle qui montre l'évolution spectaculaire de la finance durable en Suisse. Les actifs investis selon une approche durable y ont augmenté de 31% par rapport à l'année précédente pour atteindre 1 520 milliards de francs. 72% de ces investissements se trouvaient dans les portefeuilles de clients institutionnels, les clients privés détenant les 28% restants, contre 21% en 2019 et 12% en 2018. Avec de grands pouvoirs vient une grande responsabilité, dit la maxime de Spider-Man. Les banques ne sont pas des super-héroïnes et leur principal pouvoir est de transformer l'épargne des uns en crédit pour les autres. Les banques privées et les banques de gestion usent à peine de ce pouvoir car leur raison d'être est d'accompagner les grandes fortunes, privées ou institutionnelles, et de les faire croître à travers les générations. Cela implique aussi une part de responsabilité, car les investissements choisis ou conseillés par une banque ne doivent pas seulement répondre à des critères de rentabilité, mais aussi de durabilité. La bonne nouvelle est que les deux ne sont pas incompatibles, mais bien complémentaires. Dans les minutes qui suivent, j'aimerais détailler ce qui peuvent et ne peuvent pas faire les banques actives dans la gestion de fortune au sein de l'immense toile d'araignée de l'économie. Nombreux sont ceux qui tiennent les banques pour responsables du changement climatique. Pourtant, elles ne sont que des intermédiaires entre les investisseurs et les entreprises, et leur influence ne doit pas être surestimée. Il convient tout d'abord de distinguer les activités de financement de celles d'investissement. Les premières consistent à lever du capital pour une entreprise ou à lui octroyer un crédit. Ces activités, dites commerciales, amènent de l'argent neuf aux entreprises pour développer leurs projets. À l'inverse, acheter les actions et les obligations déjà émises d'une entreprise ne procure pas plus d'argent à celle-ci. C'est pourquoi appeler une banque à vendre tous les titres de telle ou telle société trop polluante ne fera perdre d'argent ni à la société ni à la banque, mais bien à ses clients, tandis que les titres seront achetés par d'autres investisseurs moins scrupuleux. Il vaut mieux, en tant que créancier ou actionnaire, faire pression sur une entreprise pour qu'elle adopte un modèle d'affaires moins polluant. La spécialité des banques privées est la gestion de fortune. La quasi-totalité des milliards qu'elles abritent n'appartiennent pas à celles-ci, mais à leurs clients, qu'ils soient des particuliers ou des professionnels, comme les caisses de pension ou les assurances. Dans la majorité des cas, ce sont les clients qui décident dans quel type d'entreprise ils veulent investir, pas les banques. Quand un mandat de gestion est conféré à une banque, celui-ci est assorti d'instructions sur le niveau de risque à prendre et les classes d'actifs à sélectionner. Dans ce cadre, les banques doivent rechercher les entreprises les plus respectueuses de l'environnement et de la société et motiver leurs clients à investir dans celles-ci. Alors pourquoi ne pas investir que dans des produits verts? Tout simplement parce qu'il n'en existe pas encore assez. Il suffit de comparer les 1 520 milliards recensés par Swiss Sustainable Finance aux quelques 4 000 milliards d'actifs gérés en Suisse pour comprendre l'ampleur du problème. Si l'on veut investir davantage dans des producteurs d'électricité solaire ou éolienne, par exemple, il faut attendre qu'ils s'en créent de nouveaux, ou sinon payer leurs actions de plus en plus cher. En ce sens, la place financière n'est qu'un miroir de l'économie réelle. C'est là que la durabilité doit commencer. Les solutions pour un avenir meilleur existent par centaines au stade d'idée. C'est pourquoi l'État doit mettre en place des conditions cadres favorables à l'innovation. Le rôle des banques est de repérer les futurs champions d'un mode de vie plus sain et d'encourager leurs clients à les soutenir. Elles le font déjà largement, notamment à travers leurs produits de private equity. Par ailleurs, il faut s'entendre sur ce qui est durable et ce qui ne l'est pas. La classification de toutes les activités économiques s'appelle la taxonomie et de nombreux États, ainsi que l'Union européenne, sont en train d'en définir une. Il vaudrait cependant mieux avoir au moins une base commune au niveau mondial, sinon une entreprise décriée dans un coin du globe trouvera son financement auprès d'une autre place financière. C'est ce à quoi travaille la plateforme internationale sur la finance durable, co-dirigée par l'Union européenne et la Chine, et que la Suisse a rejointe en mars 2020. Dans cet effort, les 17 objectifs de développement durable de l'ONU sont des points de repère importants. Lorsque cette taxonomie sera disponible, il faudra que les entreprises cotées ou d'une certaine taille l'appliquent à leurs activités, ce qui sera sans doute audité pour éviter toute complaisance. En effet, les établissements financiers dépendent des publications en matière de durabilité de l'économie réelle afin de pouvoir respecter leurs propres obligations de publication pour leurs produits financiers. En ce sens, c'est une bonne chose que le Conseil fédéral ait annoncé le 12 janvier 2021 que la Suisse adhérait aux standards de transparence en matière climatique de la Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. Mais il n'y a pas que le climat à prendre en compte dans la durabilité. Dans l'intervalle, les banques privées et les banques de gestion ne restent pas inactives, chacune dans la mesure de sa taille et de son modèle d'affaires. Elles reconnaissent que leur rôle prend une dimension supplémentaire qui est de promouvoir la transformation vers une économie plus durable et inclusive. Cela implique de reconnaître et de réorienter autant que possible des flux de capitaux vers des investissements durables. Les banquiers ne devront ainsi plus être seulement des spécialistes financiers, mais aussi des connaisseurs de l'empreinte environnementale et sociale des investissements dont ils s'occupent. Il ne s'agit pas là seulement d'identifier les risques financiers de mauvaises pratiques ou d'activités vouées à disparaître. Il s'agit surtout de s'engager à discuter avec chaque client des défis et des opportunités que présente cette transformation historique de notre société. Concrètement, de nombreux membres de nos associations ont déjà signé les principes pour l'investissement responsable des Nations Unies. Ceux qui ne l'ont pas encore fait s'efforcent de s'y préparer pour l'année prochaine. Nombreux sont ceux aussi qui souhaitent appliquer en 2022 les recommandations de la TCFD en matière de publication des risques climatiques. Par ailleurs, nos membres sont en train d'intégrer les critères de durabilité dans leur processus de recherche, de conseil et d'investissement et espèrent avoir terminé cette intégration l'année prochaine. Ce n'est pas une mince affaire, car il faut ouvrir les bases de données aux nouveaux critères, renseigner les préférences des clients et ajuster les mécanismes de contrôle. En parallèle, il faut former tous les gérants pour qu'ils comprennent ces nouveaux critères et puissent en discuter avec les clients. Le but est ainsi de faire progresser régulièrement les fonds investis selon une approche durable. Enfin, nos membres s'efforcent de réduire leurs propres émissions de gaz à effet de serre, en limitant par exemple la consommation de papier et d'énergie dans leurs locaux, en s'approvisionnant en énergie renouvelable, en évitant les déplacements inutiles, etc. Cela passe aussi par une sensibilisation accrue de nos employés aux aspects environnementaux. L'objectif est d'arriver au plus vite, et si possible bien avant 2050, date de l'engagement pris par la Suisse dans le cadre de l'accord de Paris sur le climat, à un zéro net d'émissions de gaz à effet de serre. Le chemin vers un monde durable est encore long, et il faut que tous, société civile, recherche académique, entreprises, secteur financier et État, s'y engagent ensemble. Nos deux associations favorisent bien sûr les solutions libérales qui laissent s'exprimer les forces créatrices des entreprises et des femmes et des hommes qui les composent. Il suffit de regarder les vidéos du World Economic Forum ou de la Fondation Solar Impulse pour constater que les idées pour dépolluer le monde abondent. Plutôt que d'imposer telle ou telle technologie, l'État doit favoriser l'essor de toutes et les plus efficientes s'imposeront naturellement. La transformation profonde de nos moyens de fabrication de chauffage et de transport va requérir des montants colossaux à investir pour financer les nouvelles infrastructures du futur. Celui-ci est donc prometteur pour la gestion de fortune et les banques se préparent à relever ce défi. Elles font partie de la solution et non du problème. Mais pour qu'elles puissent jouer leur rôle de manière efficiente, il est essentiel que les entreprises de l'économie réelle fournissent les informations pertinentes selon une taxonomie que l'on espère globale. La Suisse doit donc participer à l'élaboration de standards internationaux reconnus, ce qu'elle fait au sein des plateformes précitées. Il n'est pas nécessaire que la Suisse édicte des règles plus strictes. Il ne ferait pas de sens, par exemple, que les solutions mises en place par les banques pour respecter les normes européennes ne soient pas reconnues en Suisse. Mais il ne s'agit pas de suivre une checklist procédurale juste pour se donner bonne conscience. Ce qui est important, c'est que les produits financiers dits durables aient une réelle efficacité sur le climat, l'environnement et le bien-être de la société en général. Grâce aux informations comparables que fourniront les entreprises, on peut compter sur les banques pour identifier et mettre en avant les plus prometteuses avec le sérieux et la qualité qu'on leur connaît. Dans un avenir plus proche, la révision de la loi CO2 est un excellent compromis pour la Suisse. Ambitieux sur le plan environnemental et réaliste sur le plan économique, ce projet pragmatique pose les conditions cadres libérales qui permettront à la Suisse d'atteindre les objectifs de l'accord de Paris. La nouvelle loi mise sur une combinaison d'incitations financières, d'investissements et d'innovation technologique, offrant ainsi à toutes les entreprises la possibilité de concilier efficacité économique et protection du climat. Les associations bancaires soutiennent cette revision avec conviction en vue des votations de ce dimanche. Enfin, il est un domaine naissant où la Suisse accuse déjà un certain retard qu'il convient de combler au plus vite. C'est celui des obligations vertes ou durables. Alors que la bourse luxembourgeoise vient de célébrer sa 1000e obligation durable pour un volume total de plus de 500 milliards d'euros, seules 57 obligations durables sont cotées à la bourse suisse pour un volume total d'environ 18 milliards de francs. La raison en est toute simple, l'impôt anticipé suisse qui décourage les investisseurs de souscrire des obligations émises en Suisse. Les associations bancaires soutiennent donc pleinement la réforme de l'impôt anticipé qu'a initié le Conseil fédéral en avril dernier et qui supprimera cet obstacle majeur à un domaine d'avenir. Dans ce marché très en vogue, l'État n'a rien à perdre puisqu'il n'en tire aujourd'hui aucun revenu. Nous nous réjouissons d'entendre les pistes proposées par le président de la Confédération Guy Parmelin et la secrétaire Daniela Stoffel, ainsi que de connaître les vues du professeur Johann Rockström, et nous espérons que la discussion qui suivra contribuera à l'élaboration de solutions durables. Pour ma part, c'est l'occasion de prendre congé de vous, car ma présidence de la BPS prendra fin mardi prochain. Je remercie les banques privées qui m'ont accordé leur confiance pour les guider pendant 6 ans, mes collègues du comité et toute l'équipe de notre secrétariat, sans qui rien ne serait possible. Je salue aussi l'Association des banques de gestion, avec qui nous avons grand plaisir à collaborer, et je félicite son président, Marcel Rohner, pour son passage à l'échelon supérieur en septembre prochain, quand il reprendra les rênes de l'Association suisse des banquiers, notre fêtière commune. Enfin, je souhaite à mon successeur, Grégoire Bordier, autant de plaisir et d'intérêt dans ses fonctions que j'en ai eu à les exercer. Je vous remercie pour votre attention et invite maintenant Madame Nathalie Randin, journaliste indépendante et réalisatrice de reportages pour la télévision suisse romande, à me rejoindre pour la suite du programme.
Merci beaucoup, mesdames et messieurs. Restez avec nous, monsieur Mirabeau. J'aurai le plaisir de vous poser 2 questions. Mesdames et messieurs, Vous dire tout d'abord que c'est un immense plaisir de partager cette matinée en votre compagnie. Vous êtes plus de 20, une trentaine ici à partager cet événement physiquement avec nous à la Maison de la Paix. Je salue bien évidemment toutes les personnes qui nous suivent de façon virtuelle, en ligne, et vous êtes plus de 200. Yves Mirabeau, vous quittez la présidence de l'association de banques privées après 6 ans. Est-ce que vous pouvez nous dire, juste devant le micro, au pupitre, quel est l'événement, qu'est-ce qui vous a le plus marqué durant ces 6 années de présidence?
Écoutez, énormément de choses m'ont marqué, mais je crois que non seulement pendant ma présidence, mais également pendant les nombreuses années durant lesquelles j'étais membre de notre comité, c'est que finalement, on a vécu 3 phases sur ces 15-20 dernières années. Une première phase vers l'an 2012-2013, extrêmement politique, avec des discussions très stratégiques sur les problématiques d'échange d'informations, sur tous les problèmes avec différents pays que nous avons eus, avec des vrais enjeux stratégiques très complexes. Cette période s'est finie lorsque l'échange automatique d'informations a été mis en place et il a été suivi par une période de grande profusion légale et réglementaire, avec énormément de nouvelles lois et de réglementations mises en place et des discussions peut-être un peu plus frustrantes. Et je suis aussi assez heureux de constater que depuis 2 ou 3 ans, nous revenons un peu dans des discussions plus stratégiques avec des sujets tels que, par exemple, la finance durable, mais aussi d'autres. Malheureusement, un sujet qui me tient beaucoup à cœur, qui est l'accès au marché, l'accès au marché européen, j'en ai peur, être un peu mis dans les placards pendant quelques temps. Mais voilà, de nouveau, des nouvelles discussions qui s'annoncent et qui sont certainement très intéressantes et extrêmement importantes pour l'avenir de notre place financière.
Et que souhaitez-vous à votre successeur, Grégoire Bordier?
Le même plaisir que j'ai eu à mener cette tâche et justement la chance qu'il aura certainement de contribuer à ces débats très stratégiques et à venir.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Mirabeau, et je vous propose de l'applaudir. Mesdames et messieurs, cette 5e édition du Private Banking Day va vous permettre d'entendre des invités prestigieux, des experts et des représentants du monde de la banque privée. Vous aurez aussi l'occasion d'intervenir car nous avons prévu un chat et plusieurs parties interactives durant cette matinée. Au bas de votre écran, pour tous ceux qui nous suivent en ligne, vous allez trouver l'indication Q&A. C'est un onglet qui se trouve à côté de l'onglet Participants et cette interface va vous permettre de poser vos questions en ligne. For all our participants, we would be delighted for you to use the chat and share your comments and questions with us. So please use the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen. It's on the right-hand side next to participants, and this is the way to send us your questions and reactions during our event. Quel rôle pour la place financière suisse en matière d'investissement durable? Faut-il plus de règles? Des mesures volontaires sont-elles suffisantes? Pour quel impact sur le climat et l'environnement? Eh bien, nous nous poserons toutes ces questions ce matin, mais tout d'abord, nous allons débuter notre matinée avec le message du président de la Confédération, Guy Parmelin, le chef du département de l'économie, de la formation et de la recherche, adresse ce message personnel à toutes les banques qui pratiquent la gestion de fortune en Suisse. Guy Parmelin.
Monsieur le Président, Mesdames et Messieurs, chers membres de l'Association de banques privées suisses, les circonstances me contraignent à m'adresser à vous à distance. Je le fais néanmoins avec un immense plaisir, doublé de l'honneur qui m'échoit de saluer à travers les banques privées que vous représentez un fleuron de l'économie suisse. Tout d'abord, je dois me féliciter de l'excellente réputation internationale dont jouissent les banques suisses. Et je me félicite également de leur heureuse disposition à évoluer avec leur époque. Qui n'avance pas recule, dit un adage français. Ainsi, s'intéresser aujourd'hui à la finance durable, c'est s'assurer d'avancer sur le chemin du progrès et s'octroyer ainsi des chances renouvelées de succès. Qu'il s'agisse de gestion de fortune, de conseils en placement ou de fonds de pension, les investissements financiers durables sont au cœur de l'actualité. En Suisse aussi, les investissements financiers durables ont effectué un bond spectaculaire passant de 142 milliards de francs à plus de 1163 milliards de francs entre 2015 et 2019. Il est donc opportun et surtout essentiel de discuter sans a priori des possibilités et des limites, des opportunités et des risques, des défis et des conditions cadres de ce marché en pleine croissance. Je me réjouis dès lors que vous consacriez ce Private Banking Day 2021 à un thème de cette importance. Avant de vous exposer quelques brèves considérations en relation avec mon département, j'aimerais remercier les banques du rôle qu'elles remplissent au profit de la société, notamment à travers leurs contributions fiscales et par leur engagement au service de la formation et de la formation continue. Sur le plan conjoncturel, je n'oublie pas que le système bancaire suisse a contribué de façon déterminante à la mise en œuvre des mesures d'amortissement économique de la Confédération au plus fort de la crise du Covid-19. Grâce à lui, l'économie suisse a pu garder la tête hors de l'eau, si j'ose m'exprimer ainsi, et limiter la casse. En tant que ministre de l'économie, j'observe une mutation structurelle significative, qu'elle soit imposée par l'environnement extérieur ou spontanément décidée par l'industrie elle-même. Le progrès technologique, l'évolution démographique, la réglementation sont quelques-uns des facteurs qui y conduisent. Dans ce contexte, une part croissante, sinon prépondérante des investissements est désormais définie par des critères de durabilité. Les produits de financement, les modèles commerciaux, les services de conseil se ressentent tous fortement de ces critères. À la lumière de cette thématique nouvelle, le Conseil fédéral est d'avis que la place financière suisse doit renforcer son rôle de référence mondiale en la matière. Dans ce but, elle doit évidemment continuer d'améliorer sa compétitivité et son positionnement international en adaptant régulièrement les conditions cadres de son économie. La Confédération entend ici agir dans 4 domaines spécifiques: la sécurité juridique, l'augmentation de la transparence, une meilleure prise en compte des risques financiers et, quatrièmement, l'observation des développements internationaux afin de s'assurer en tout temps de la capacité d'exportation de la place financière suisse. Comme ministre de l'Éducation, ensuite, j'observe que la mondialisation représente un phénomène économique majeur. Beaucoup la décrient parce qu'elle tend, selon eux, à laisser les plus petits et les plus faibles au bord du chemin, tandis que d'autres y voient plutôt une opportunité. De toute évidence, la mondialisation, et avec elle le progrès au sens large, définissent de nouvelles exigences, celles notamment de créer de la valeur. Pour cela, notre pays devra continuer de capitaliser sur les connaissances, sur l'expertise, afin qu'il reste en pôle position des talents dans une compétition qui a aujourd'hui totalement débordé les frontières. C'est vous confirmer que notre système de formation académique et professionnelle, en lien direct et constant avec la pratique, doit impérativement être préservé et maximisé. Cela vaut pour la place financière suisse également, puisqu'elle aussi a besoin de spécialistes hautement qualifiés. Cette exigence ne diminuera pas avec l'émergence de la finance durable. Cette dernière lance au contraire une foule de nouveaux défis assortis de nouveaux risques découlant d'instruments inédits et néanmoins exigeants. En clair, la finance verte n'est pas un banc d'essai pour boursicoteurs amateurs. Elle représente un concept ambitieux, complexe et innovant, réservé de ce fait à de vrais spécialistes. Enfin, en ma qualité de ministre de la Recherche, je m'interroge sur le sens exact de la durabilité et sur notre capacité à l'anticiper et à l'objectiver. Sur ce terrain encore en friche, les marchés en croissance peuvent malheureusement aussi attirer des aventuriers et des opportunistes tentés de profiter d'un effet de mode par pur intérêt. L'éco-blanchiment ou greenwashing n'est à cet égard qu'un simple produit de marketing qui vient saper les efforts visant par ailleurs à rendre les investissements réellement durables et qui nuit ainsi à leur crédibilité. J'encourage dès lors à fonder les investissements dits durables sur des résultats scientifiques interdisciplinaires étayés. Le secteur financier en est conscient, lui aussi, puisqu'un nombre croissant de ces spécialistes sont au bénéfice d'une formation diversifiée en mathématiques, en informatique ou encore en sciences naturelles. Mesdames et messieurs, notre pays est, comme d'autres, à un tournant. L'augmentation de l'espérance de vie, la baisse du taux de natalité et l'allongement de la durée des études entraînent un déclin de la population en âge de travailler, alors que la population globale continue, elle, d'augmenter. Les besoins essentiels perdurent ou s'accroissent. La mobilité, la santé, l'éducation, la recherche et l'innovation, qui tous nécessitent des investissements substantiels. Parallèlement, la croissance démographique et la prospérité dopent la consommation. Ce double constat nous contraint plus que jamais à solliciter nos ressources naturelles de façon raisonnée et responsable. Notre qualité de vie en dépend. Face à cette exigence de durabilité, le système bancaire suisse peut être un intermédiaire de première force et la durabilité être par conséquent un sérieux atout pour notre place financière, à condition cependant que le cadre réglementaire soit précis et que la transparence prévale. Je souhaite un succès durable à la place bancaire suisse. Je vous souhaite à vous de fructueux échanges autour de ce thème et vous remercie de votre attention.
Mesdames et messieurs, nous allons passer une matinée multilingue. Nous allons passer du français à l'anglais et à l'allemand. Et notre prochain invité va s'exprimer en anglais, justement. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to introduce to you our keynote speaker. Johan Högström is a Swedish professor. He is an international expert, specialist of water use and global sustainability. He currently heads the Potsdam Institute for Climate Research in Germany. We have asked him this morning to expose the consequences of climate change on social and economic issues. Professor Högström, you are with us live from Germany. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Wonderful to be with you.
Great. We hear you perfectly. We are very happy to have you online. Thank you for accepting our invitation. And before I let you begin your talk, I would just like to tell the public, our participants, that it is possible to leave comments and questions on our chat. We would like to offer you, our audience, the possibility to interact with Professor Högström at the end of his speech. So please don't hesitate to use our Q&A during the presentation. It's on the right-hand side of your screen on the bottom line. So thank you very much. And please, Professor Högström, now it's your moment.
Merci beaucoup, and I'm honored to be here with you at this important juncture. I'll be sharing my screen and hopefully there we are. Hopefully this will work. So, ladies and gentlemen, what I will do is basically provide the scientific evidence that President Parmelin is absolutely right, that the banking sector must now speed up towards really transitioning where green finance becomes no more a corporate social responsibility, or at worst case, even a greenwashing, as President Parmelin pointed out, but actually being a strategic core business direction for the entire private banking sector. And of course, any such talk to provide the scientific evidence of transformative change in the financial sector must start with what I would argue being the most important scientific message to humanity over the last 20 years, namely that we have shifted from being this relatively small economy on a big planet to now being a very big economy impacting on the entire planet to the extent that we have become our own geological epoch. Can you imagine? We have now left the Holocene. the epoch we've been in since the last ice age and are now in the Anthropocene. We are the dominating force of change on planet Earth. We are sitting in the driving seat, starting to hit the ceiling of hardwired biophysical processes that regulates the state of the planet. The scale, the speed, and interconnectivity is today unprecedented. We can even show evidence that the pandemic, which is not a black swan, a terrible global crisis, which was predicted, a manifestation of the hyperconnected global world in the Anthropocene. Now, the impacts of this are known and felt, and the drivers and evidence well established. I won't go through much of that actually, just to remind us that 2020 is the warmest year on record. The last 10 years is the warmest decade on record. But most importantly, we have now crashed through the warmest temperature on Earth since we left the last ice age 12,000 years ago. We are at 1.2 degrees Celsius warming, and we're starting to feel the costs across human and economic systems. 2020 was another record year. I won't go through the list here, but just to remind that we have today a new normal in terms of heat waves. 2020, we almost forget that now in the pandemic, that it started with the worst forest fires ever in Australia. You know that we now have the second consecutive severe drought and forest fire season in California right as we speak. In Siberia, we recorded a complete shock actually to scientists, a 38 degrees Celsius temperature up on the Siberian Arctic tundra, which is of course contributing to speed up the permafrost thawing across the vast stocks of carbon in the peatlands in Siberia. And we have continued extreme events across the world. We also have new science emerging on the impacts of 1.2 degrees Celsius warming. You may have read this extraordinary paper joining forces of glaciologists across the entire world, showing that all glaciers, shown here with the red drops, the longer they are, the more mass the glaciers are losing, that all glaciers on Earth are losing mass. Look at the rapid pace of loss in Alaska. Look at the Arctic, the ground zero in terms of ice melt. On Greenland, the Arctic sea ice, but look also at the third pole, the Himalayas, which has been a discussed issue scientifically for many years. Now the evidence is unequivocally in place. The Himalayas are losing mass. They're not losing as fast as some other glaciers, but it's going downhill. And this is, of course, a geopolitical massive challenge because it is the water tap for social stability across Pakistan, India, Southeast Asia, and parts of China. But I will be focusing on this little blue marble and the state of science on the stability of the Earth system. This is the famous Apollo 8 picture of Earthrise, and we're now at this Earthrise moment because science now shows unequivocally that we are now at the transformative moment. This is the start of the decade when we need to cut global emissions by half. We need to halt nature loss. And we also need to understand even deeper the following question. Are we at risk of destabilizing the entire Earth system? We've come to that point. That is the point we now need to research. Here is perhaps the most important, I would argue, global climate modeling result of the last year. It is the first time a mathematical physical climate model is able to reproduce the orbital forcing and the journey of our planet over the last 3 million years. So on the x-axis here, you have the entire so-called quaternary period, 3 million years. On the y-axis is the average mean temperature on Earth. The 0 point is the pre-industrial temperature, the 14 degrees Celsius world before we started burning fossil fuels. In green, you see the model reproduction of how the planet oscillates up and down from cold ice age periods to warm periods. And of course, there's really significant natural variabilities across the entire period. But at no point does the planet exceed or go through a 2 degrees Celsius threshold. The planet has been staying within a very narrow corridor, despite all the natural forcings, despite the massive journeys between deep ice ages with 70-meter lower sea levels on Earth, all the way to the warmest points. But it's always been within a maximum of 2 degrees Celsius warming, the warmest points, and a minus 4 to 5 degrees Celsius, the coldest point. And one important finding here is that one explanation why the planet has remained in this corridor is the planet's feedbacks and resilience. And we have the evidence for this. We have the seminal work in the Global Carbon Project, which is the global annual monitoring of all carbon emissions on Earth. Now, this is just the contemporary curve, but it shows the proof of Earth resilience. This is from 1850 until today on the x-axis, and you have on the y-axis carbon dioxide flux in billion tons of carbon per year. Above the zero line, you have the known to all of us, the hockey stick of burning fossil fuels in gray and deforestation in orange, the loading of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But as we know, it's not all of this that has caused the 1.2 degrees Celsius warming so far. No, we have this remarkable capacity in dark green of the oceans to take up carbon dioxide, up to 30%, and another 25-30% on land in light green. So it's only the blue part, which is the residual, that has warmed up the planet so far. And if you look at the graph, you see this super pedagogic story of a healthy planet. The more we stress her, the more the biogeophysical processes dampen and absorb and cool the planet. This is a healthy planet operating its biogeophysical systems to stay within the narrow corridor. You lose resilience and you risk crossing tipping points, and feedbacks may take the planet in the wrong direction. So this is the drama, and this is also something humbling, I would argue. We know with high degree of scientific certainty today that the planet has stayed within a very narrow corridor and that all the components of the Earth system supports its ability to remain stable. Unfortunately, we have more and more signs like this, showing on the left-hand side the seminal piece that came out just 3 weeks ago, that the Brazilian Amazon over the last 10 years has tipped over from being a sink of carbon to now being a net source of carbon. And there's so many papers supporting this finding of a gradual loss of resilience in the big tropical rainforest. And I just want to kind of make the take home point here that there's so much at stake, because we are in the Anthropocene putting all this pressure. But look at the planet we're leaving. This is the ice core data just over the last 20,000 years, just to really lift out the details. Again, on the y-axis, you have mean temperature on Earth. So the 0 point is the pre-industrial 14 degrees Celsius world. We leave the last ice age 20,000 years ago, start the journey out of the ice age from the deep, deep minus 4 degrees Celsius world. And look at what happens. We enter this remarkably stable blue line, the Holocene, a warm interglacial state of the planet. It is a plus minus 1 degree Celsius planet. It has variability within it, but this is the planet we know. This is the planet that has enabled everything we value to be developed. The modern world establishes itself in the Holocene. Before the Holocene, we were just a few million people. We were hunters and gatherers. We were living in caves. We go into the Holocene, we invent agriculture, and off we go in this civilizational journey as we know it. And look at the journey we started taking when we stepped into the Industrial Revolution. The spiking vertical line that is now taking us currently on a 2.5 to 2.9 degrees Celsius warmer world just in the next 80 years. So that is what is at stake. And the latest assessment shows that, the Anthropocene is a pressure point. That in itself raises concern. But as long as the Earth system is resilient, we have a chance to stabilize. But the latest assessment shows that 9 out of the 15 tipping element system, the global commons systems that regulates the ability of the planet to absorb carbon dioxide, to cool the planet, is starting to show signs of instability, being on the move. We don't know in what direction. We're not suggesting they've crossed tipping points, but they are moving in the wrong, in a way, away from the stable range that we have seen over the past Holocene. Here are the 9, and the big finding here, which is at the frontier of science, admittedly, it's not as if we have conclusive findings here, are the arrows, that we have more and more indications that these tipping elements, not only are they showing signs of being on the move, but they are interconnected. So just to give you one example here, that when we have accelerated ice loss on Greenland and the Arctic summer sea ice, which releases cold fresh water into the North Atlantic, it has slowed down the AMOC, the Atlantic overturning of heat, and that this slowdown is affecting the Amazon monsoon, which can explain the rising frequency of droughts and forest fires over the Amazon, but it also locks in more warm surface water in the Southern Ocean, which in turn can explain the accelerated melting and the observations of big ice sheets sliding down into the Southern Ocean from West Antarctica, the so-called Doomsday Glacier, the Thwaites Glacier. So what you see here is this delicacy of staying away from tipping elements moving too close to thresholds, also because they are interconnected. So there's no surprise that science 10 years ago developed the planetary boundary framework. It was building on all this evidence that if we are in the Anthropocene, if there are nonlinear dynamics, if there are tipping points, of course we need to scientifically define quantitative targets that can give us a guardrail, a fence, a safe space, what I call boundaries of a safe operating space shown in green, by defining the systems that regulates the state of the planet. The 9 boundaries are, as far as we know today, from Earth system science, the systems we need to be managing for regulating the planet's state in that corridor. And it's not only climate, as you see, it's also biodiversity. It is forest and land system change. It's the global hydrological cycle. It is nitrogen and phosphorus that we're overloading today across the entire planet. It is ocean acidification. It's the stratospheric ozone layer and the 2 still unquantified boundaries on air pollutants and chemicals. As you may have seen, we have 4 of the 9 boundaries outside of the green safe space, which can explain also that we're seeing so many impacts, and the task now is to turn back as quickly as possible. We can come back to this if we want to discuss more in detail. I just want to flag to you that there are operationalizations of the planetary boundary framework across the world with studies and applications, for example, most recently for the New Zealand economy. We have also a connection between this earth sciences with the stability of economies, which comes closer to the financial sector. This is a study that came out quite recently showing the drama if we do not return into a safe space for climate. On the background here, you have the color of stability of economies, kind of the basic maps that you're so familiar with in terms of economic stability. The darker the color, blue-green, are the stable economies, the red are the more fragile economies. The black spots here are the regions that today have an annual mean temperature exceeding 29 degrees Celsius. That's a pure health threshold, meaning that above 29 degrees Celsius of average temperature per year, we have state of risk with regards to intolerable levels of heat for human health, potential mortality rates increase, and potential unhealth. So it's not a surprise that these black dots are in the Sahara Desert with very few people. But look at the hatched lines. These are the regions that will have more than 29 degrees Celsius in 50 years' time, 50, if we continue burning fossil fuels as today. This is, you just look at the map, and at least I get, very, very deeply concerned. I mean, here we're talking Brazil, the whole of the Sahel, the Horn of Africa, the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia. 3.5 billion people, many, many vulnerable and fragile economies that would be living under conditions that do not support human livelihoods. This is, of course, a recipe for instability. And if you overlay that with the finance and the economy, I mean, you've certainly seen these studies that are now being published increasingly, showing on the upper graph here in dark red, the countries that under business as usual, just because of labor productivity decline because of higher temperatures, would be losing over 25% of their GDPs over the next 50 years, and 80 years, sorry, up until 2100. But you just have to look at how these maps overlap, that you have this kind of perfect storms gathering with health risks, economic risks, and inherent fragility coinciding. And we don't want that to happen. And we know also that this can spill over across the entire world, because it also shows in dark red here the assessment that these are the hotspots for migration, displacement, migration, conflict, which of course spills over in different regions of the world. So this is why we need that transition. rapidly. And this is the IPCC summary showing that 2020 is the last point to bend the global curve of emissions if we are to stand a chance of landing in the safe space on 1.5 degrees Celsius climate boundary. The green pathway is the net zero world economy by 2050. It is taken into consideration that we only have some 400 billion tons of carbon dioxide remaining in the carbon budget. That green line translates to what we call the carbon law, which is inspired by the Moore's law of the pace we now need to innovate and transform. It says simply that if we cut emissions by half every decade, we follow that green line. And that green line is summarized in this graph. It's the gray curve, which is then bending the curve 2020, cut emissions by half every decade, and we have this net zero point by 2050. But as you know, this will not be enough. We also need to have a food system transition from the dark brown wedge here, food system being the single largest emitter of greenhouse gases, to become a sink, a part of the solution in the orange wedge from 2050 onwards. I mean, this is an agricultural revolution across the world. And then, as if that was not enough, we also need to start scaling carbon capture and storage at a scale that we haven't seen at all so far in the yellow line. And as if that was not enough, we also need to maintain nature's capacity to stay in the corridor, meaning the carbon sinks on land in green and healthy oceans in blue. And if we do all of this, we have this 66% chance of staying well below 2, a 50% chance of reaching 1.5. So that is what is at stake. And the carbon law can be quantified, and we do that increasingly and can be connected also to different businesses. We know that we have a massive gap in emissions, as you certainly know from the UNEP gap report, so we are not following the right track. There's so much at stake here with COP26 coming up later this year, so the financial sector is so fundamental. Science is trying to help this as much as possible, not least through this initiative, the Global Commons Alliance, where we now have set up an Earth Commission to the left, which is an attempt to collectively across disciplines define a safe and just space for humanity on Earth, and then translate that to science-based targets, just like we do for climate, the Science-Based Target Initiative, but to have also for the other planetary boundaries, the Science-Based Target Network. We also see momentum of quantified targets that can guide investments in the financial sector. We have the 1.5 degrees Celsius target for climate. We are now seeing emerging a global goal for nature, which will hopefully land on the table for the Kunming UN Biodiversity Summit later this year in October. And what this is saying today, which is a proposal, is to halt the loss of nature from 2020 as a reference point, equivalent to the net zero loss of emissions, and be net positive by 2030, which would mean reaching an inflection point on nature loss over this decade and reach back to surface through regeneration and investments in all forms of nature-based solutions, and then move towards full recovery by 2050. So I'm just sharing this as an attempt to show that we're starting to see a portfolio of guardrails for climate and nature in the policy sphere, which I think can be very valuable for the banking sector to be guided by. 1.5, cutting emissions by half for climate, zero loss of nature, and nature positive by 2030, giving a very good alignment for investments in nature-based solutions. Is there reason for hope here? I would certainly say yes. I think what happened after the Biden summit with the establishment of what I call, at least, it's not there formally now that we have a G7 in just around the corner, that we now have a G3 on climate. We have the three largest economies, the US, the European Union, and China, stepping up behind science to define science-based targets for climate. Net zero loss by 2050 for the US and the European Union, no later than 2060 for China. Not fully aligned with science, but this will spill over across the economies in the world, because here are the three big ones stepping up and saying that in 30 years' time, we will be off fossil fuels. And of course, at the Biden summit, which you know so well, and I'm so impressive and really admire the leadership provided by the private banking sector of establishing the Net Zero Banking Alliance. I mean, you are sitting at the tap determining the investments in infrastructure. So you determine the long-term chances we have over the next coming decades. And I think this initiative is extraordinarily important, so strongly supported by the Partha Gupta UK government initiated commission on the economics of nature, which also provided additional evidence that now we need to have a turnaround, internalizing all the externalities, running the taxonomy, as President Parmelin pointed out, for the economy, and recognizing which is this is taken from one of the leading economists, that the economy must now operate within the planetary boundaries. It has to be guided within scientifically defined, non-negotiable guardrails for a stable and resilient Earth system. So things are happening. And of course, with Mark Carney sitting at the helm for the finance run-up for COP26, with all the momentum that you are part of scoring on, I think there is a real window here. Of course, we have to get the 1 trillion from the European Green Deal to really start working for a zero carbon, nature positive future. You're sitting right at the center there with the financing of the transition. I'm quite concerned here that the 1 trillion seems to be kind of allowed to be used in so many different ways. But we are, at least at the Potsdam Institute, engaging, for example, with the network on greening the financial sector to connect the scientific necessity with the kind of directions for the financial flows. And I'm really excited about that. And I think you're sitting like almost at the center stage of what I think all are hoping for, to be a social tipping point. So this is my last slide, just to say that I think we all recognize that it's a very turbulent time right now. We're in this post-COVID transition. We have so many elements of change, of mass movements, political progress, the market forces. The market forces are fundamental. That is starting to become so obvious that zero carbon electric mobility, for example, outperforms economically, even without subsidies, fossil fuel based mobility. So we have these disruptions occurring, but we're not yet fully across the threshold. And the question is, how can we speed up and scale this process? And I think the private banking sector, you are one of the key elements for success in this journey. So with that, thank you so much, and back to you.
Thank you very much, Jan Röckström, for this very clear, powerful, striking presentation. We have received a couple of questions. I would first like to ask you that the first question is, do you think that the IEA latest net zero pathway is realistic?
Yeah, thanks for this question. And I should start by saying that we, myself and our colleagues at PIC, have not gone through in detail the very, very rich IEA report. But overall, we are assessing that this is a very important step forward. It is IEA really recognizing that we now need a transition to a 1.5 degrees Celsius future, and they are actually putting quite realistic ranges on negative emissions in particular. They are putting realistic ranges also on the food system transition. They're not exaggerating any of the nature-based solutions or transitions of non-CO2 gases. So all of this leads to a conclusion that IEA has done a scientifically robust assessment, which leads to a net zero landing by 2050. So the question then is it realistic? Well, I think their assessment is, which I support, that this is possible to achieve. The question is, will the political and economic system really step up to deliver at that scale and pace? So it's still to be seen, but I think it's, if you look back at the IEA reports of the past, this is quite a significant step forward.
Another question about control. Who should control actually the application of the ESG criteria? This is a very interesting question. You were talking about a G3. Do you have an answer?
Well, of course, we have for the different domains we're talking about here, we have weak, but we do have international regulatory regimes. So I think they should continue being strengthened and given trust to continue being the monitoring basis we have. So, for example, for climate, that we have the UNFCCC, we have the entire Paris legally binding Paris Agreement, and I think that those mechanisms should be used also for monitoring and keeping the verification, the MVR parts functioning. Then, of course, how it plays out for different sectors and different geographies, I think it will vary. I mean, just look at the European Union, where we now have the emergence of two ETS systems. I mean, one in the traded emission trading system, but also all the non-traded sectors like transport, for example. And of course, this will be a question of national, let's say, monitoring systems combined with regional. So I think it's not easy to answer that question in terms of I don't foresee there will be some kind of one global point for all checks on ESGs, but I think there will be multiple points of control.
Okay, I have one more, not easy question, actually, pretty tough one. Which organism should control the quality of financial products who are said to be green, and how can we avoid greenwashing?
No,
Let's try to make it short. I know it's a big question. Greenwashing is a big question, but maybe on the which organism should control, do you have an answer?
No, I don't have a direct answer because that organism unfortunately does not exist, formally speaking. I think we need to seriously put in place more kind of scientific committees that help in the quality control of different ESG measures, and same goes with all forms of offsetting, for example. Now there is a very messy market out there. Of course, we have some of the UN initiatives like a global compact and others, and I think they should be also strengthened in many cases depending on sector. So again, it's quite a diverse landscape out there, but it needs very significant support for strengthening.
I would like to ask the audience here in Geneva, do you have question? We have a microphone here, and I would like to let you raise your hand if you're interested in asking a question to Professor Hochströmer. Okay, great. So if it's not the case, I would like to thank you, Professor Hochström, for this very interesting, powerful presentation. Thank you for being with us this morning, and have a nice day in Germany.
Thank you so much. Good luck with the next continuation of the Congress. Thanks.
Nous avons maintenant le plaisir d'accueillir Daniela Stoffel, secrétaire d'État aux questions financières internationales. Madame Stoffel a été diplomate en poste à Washington, Berlin et Paris avant de devenir l'ambassadrice de la place financière suisse au département fédéral des finances. Nous lui avons demandé de nous expliquer quelle est la stratégie de la Confédération pour réduire l'impact du réchauffement climatique et quel doit être le rôle de la place financière dans ce processus. Daniela Stoffel, Sie sind Staatssekretärin für internationale Finanzfragen. Willkommen in Genf und vielen Dank für Ihre Ausführungen heute Morgen und das wäre auf Deutsch.
Sehr geehrte Damen, sehr geehrte Herren, es freut mich sehr, heute bei Ihnen zu sein. Damen, ich sehe noch eine, freue mich sehr. Ich komme immer gerne nach Genf zu Ihnen. Der Bundespräsident hat es schon gesagt, Sie nehmen eine wesentliche Funktion wahr, sei das für den Finanzplatz Schweiz oder auch für die gesamte Wirtschaft. Ich fange an, Sie haben mir eigentlich zwei Stichworte gegeben. Ich werde eher ein bisschen den größeren Rahmen beschreiben, bevor wir dann sicher nachher auf dem Panel über die einzelnen Maßnahmen und konkreten Politikbereiche zu sprechen kommen, die wir seitens der Behörden in diesem Themenbereich planen. Sie haben mir 2 Stichworte gegeben, indem Sie den Titel Ihrer Veranstaltung einerseits eben unter den Titel des Klimawandels gestellt haben und auf der anderen Seite aber doch auch darauf hingewiesen haben, dass eben Ihre Tätigkeit ein Schlüsselexportprodukt in der Schweiz ist. Und es wurde ganz zu Beginn beim ersten Referat, ich kann mich eigentlich auf alle Referate, die schon gehalten wurden, beziehen, es wurde schon sehr viel gesagt, der Marktzugang auch ins Zentrum gestellt. Und ich denke, ich habe hier eine Brücke, denn wir sind ja offensichtlich nach wie vor in einer sehr starken Position. Wir haben vor kurzem entschieden, dass wir stark genug sind, um auf unseren Stärken aufzubauen und uns weniger zu integrieren, dort, wo es politisch im Moment nicht möglich scheint. Wir müssen diesen komparativen Vorteil und diese Stärken wahren. Ne? Das heißt nicht, dass wir uns nicht stetig weiter bemühen werden, um auch den Marktzugang grenzüberschreitend auch in unsere Nachbarländer hinein herbeizuführen. Aber wir können das nicht tun, wenn wir nicht unter den Besten sind. Und im Bereich der Nachhaltigkeit zu den Besten zu gehören, ist sage ich mal, de rigueur. Das lässt aber nicht den Umkehrschluss zu, dass die Besten auch zum Markt zugelassen werden. Ich interessiere mich dann aber schon noch für die Frage, ob unsere großen Partner, auch die großen Blöcke, die vorher erwähnt wurden, auch unter dem Primat der Nachhaltigkeit dann Marktabschottung betreiben, denn es geht ja hier doch um die Rettung des Planeten. Wenn ich dann zur Nachhaltigkeit im Finanzbereich komme, dann sind Sie ja wirklich ideal platziert, um hier in einer Führungsrolle zu sein. Sie und die Versicherung, denn Ihr Kerngeschäft ist, die Zukunft zu kennen. Übersetzt in die Situation, dass Sie die Risiken richtig einschätzen können. Sie können allozieren zwischen Konsum heute und morgen und Konsumverzicht respektive Investition in die Zukunft, zeitlich und auch über die Geografie hinweg. Also wer, wenn nicht Sie, muss hier im Zentrum aktiv sein. Sie sind die Intermediäre unseres Tuns und haben eine zentrale Rolle in diesem Bereich. Hingegen ist diese Rolle nicht einfach und Ihr Geschäft war noch nie einfach. Ich denke, es wird auch nicht einfacher, sondern es wird wahrscheinlich eher schwieriger. Wir haben gesehen, was die Naturwissenschaft sagt, was die Fakten sagen. Die sprechen für sich und wir sind wahrscheinlich nicht erst seit 8000 Jahren im Anthropozän. Wenn Sie die Verbreitung des Menschen über den Planeten anschauen, dann hat er überall eine Spur der Verwüstung hinterlassen, der Mensch. Andere Kulturen werden dann irgendwann, wenn sie über ihre Größe und ihre Nachhaltigkeit hinauswachsen, gehen unter. Und wir stehen jetzt vor der Situation, ob wir es schaffen, hier den Turnaround hinzukriegen oder nicht. Also der Mensch war schon immer ein Ausrotter und eine Gefährdung für alle anderen Arten auf dem Planeten und mittlerweile auch für seine eigene Umwelt. Also wir haben die Fakten, die sprechen für sich. Dann haben wir auch ganz viele andere Faktoren, die Sie zu berücksichtigen haben und die mit hinreichender Unsicherheit geprägt sind. Nicht? Sie haben einerseits kommende Generationen von Investoren, die sich darauf berufen werden, dass dann zum Beispiel ihre Pensionen eines Tages fällig werden, wenn die Investitionen, auf denen diese Pensionen beruhen, eigentlich in einem Net-Zero-Umfeld gewährleistet sein müssen. Sie haben aber auch ein Kontinuum, und es wurde das Greenwashing ernannt, zwischen Schein und ein bisschen auch Wohlfühl, ich sage jetzt mal, Gebaren, nicht? Die Vollkostenrechnung unseres Konsums, der dann nachhaltig genannt wird, die lässt immer noch auf sich warten. Ist es nun tatsächlich nachhaltiger, wenn ich ein Plastikgeschirr benutze und es wegwerfe und es dann verbrannt wird? Oder ist es nachhaltiger, wenn selbiges Geschirr jetzt aus Bambus ist? Der Bambus muss auch irgendwo wachsen, da müssen andere Pflanzen weichen, das wird transportiert, das wird verarbeitet. Die Vollkostenrechnung, die ist uns die Wirtschaft noch schuldig. Ich komme später auf die Daten zu sprechen. Und dann haben wir eben die harten Fakten. Und auch dort die Spannbreite, und die tut sich übrigens auch zwischen Europa und den USA auf, wenn wir schon von dieser Allianz sprechen, nicht? Ist es mehr mit Technologie zu schaffen? Oder ist es mehr mit Verzicht und Bepreisung zu schaffen? Und wie wir es auch in der Schweiz erleben, ist es wahrscheinlich eine Mischung zwischen beidem. Sie haben also die Politik, die spielt ihre eigene Rolle. Und wir haben die Gelegenheit, am nächsten Wochenende hier auch als Souverän Stellung zu beziehen in der CO2-Bepreisung. Auch darauf werde ich noch zurückkommen. Sie haben mittlerweile auch Gerichte, die sich in diese Diskussion manifestieren, nicht? Sie haben Präzedenzurteile in Europa, in Australien, wo auf der Basis der Gewährung der Menschenrechte gewisse Unternehmen in die Pflicht genommen werden. Was, wenn eines Tages Nachhaltigkeit im Sinne der Pflicht der Erhaltung der Lebensgrundlagen für kommende Generationen, zum Beispiel in der Verfassung erblickt wird oder unter dem Titel Wohlstand? Also das Ausweichen auf die Gerichtsbarkeit, wenn die Politik und die Wirtschaft und die Wissenschaft hier nicht gemeinsam am Strick ziehen, das hat sich jetzt auch manifestiert. Sie haben Investoren, institutionelle Investoren und solche, die auch, um Märkte quasi, um eigene Voraussagen wahr werden zu lassen, auch als Eigner ihre Funktionen erfüllen und die Unternehmen in eine gewisse Richtung schieben. Sie sind wirklich in einem, nur schon von Seiten der Ansprechpartner und der Akteure, die Sie einbeziehen müssen in Ihre Gleichung, in einer sehr herausgeforderten Lage. Und ich möchte das noch auf die Spitze treiben, indem auch die Märkte, ich sage jetzt mal, nicht mehr das sind, was sie waren, respektive sie haben zunehmend die Aushebelung von Märkten. Die Funktion des Staates wird eigentlich immer nur noch verstärkt, transponiert über die enormen Defizite, die die Staaten haben, die sie finanzieren müssen, für die sie Einnahmenquellen haben müssen, die Staatsaufgaben, die wir eigentlich in der liberalen Schweiz eher als dort, wo es nicht anders geht und wo es um öffentliche Güter geht, definieren. Die werden global ganz anders gesehen. Wir erleben das im Moment zum Beispiel in der Diskussion der Verteilung des Steuersubstrats, nicht, wo es letztlich darum geht, einfach Defizite zu finanzieren und wo hochproduktive Staaten wie die Schweiz nun nolens volens die Staatsquote ebenfalls erhöhen müssen, respektive sich in diesem Umfeld einfinden müssen. Die Märkte werden auch wirklich seriös beeinträchtigt werden durch die Informationsmöglichkeiten der Zukunft. Wenn Sie sich das Szenario der künstlichen Intelligenzen und der kommunikativen Kraft, die diese Technologie darstellen wird, überlegen, in Bezug auf zum Beispiel die Tatsachen, die die Wissenschaft vermittelt, und wie diese Tatsachen dann eben als andere Tatsachen anderswo durch künstliche Intelligenzen mit beeinflusst werden, dann ist das eine der wahrscheinlich wichtigsten Vektoren, die Sie auch mit in Betracht ziehen müssen. Und drittens als Beispiel noch zu nennen, hätten wir ja eigentlich die Möglichkeit, die Märkte oder das Kollektiv neu zusammenzustellen. Wir haben eine Technologie, die Blockchain, die eigentlich sowohl den Intermediär wie auch den Garantor Staat nicht mehr benötigen würde. Da haben wir es erlebt am Beispiel eines Stablecoins, dass die Staaten, also quasi die eine Art der Repräsentation des Souveräns, nicht bereit ist, eine andere Organisationsform für den Souverän zuzulassen. Also auch die Rolle des Staates und wie er mit den Märkten umgeht, steht zur Disposition. Und das ist für Sie relevant, um zu wissen, wie Sie die Risiken, die Sie bepreisen müssen, jenseits der baren, nackten Tatsachen, wie Sie zum Ziel kommen, um hier die besten Entscheide über die lange Frist zu treffen. Nun habe ich viel geredet und bin Ihnen immer noch die Antwort schuldig und auch ein bisschen das Nehmen der Befürchtung, oder, dass wir reinkommen und normativ unterwegs sind und sagen, voilà, 1,5%, das macht ihr jetzt so. Unser Zugang in der Schweiz ist ein ganz anderer. Was wir Ihnen geben wollen, ist in dieser Gemengelage, die ich Ihnen jetzt ein bisschen geschildert habe und die noch sehr viel breiter ist, auch der Bundespräsident hat sie angesprochen, was wir Ihnen geben wollen, ist Klarheit und einen sicheren Rahmen. Und dort, wo wir eine Rolle spielen können, um die Faktoren, die Sie einbeziehen müssen in Ihre Geschäftsentscheide, um die so klar wie möglich machen zu können. Was haben Sie als Grundlage? Sie haben das Bekenntnis der Schweiz zu 2030. Sie haben das Bekenntnis zu Net Zero 2050, dann haben Sie unsere Beitritt zum Paris Agreement. Übrigens wird wohl am COP26 der berühmte Paragraph 2c über die Finanzflüsse noch einmal ausgelegt. Er steht dort zur Debatte. Dann haben Sie eine Strategie zu nachhaltigen Finanzen des Bundesrates vom letzten Jahr, die besagt, wir wollen einerseits eben uns an den Fakten und nicht an den Mythen und an den Ideologien orientieren und andererseits wollen wir dafür sorgen, dass es hier immer um Wettbewerbsfähigkeit und dass es keine Diskrepanz gibt zwischen beiden Zielen. Ein Mittel, und das wurde auch schon genannt, ein relativ einfaches Mittel im Bereich des Klimas wäre die schlichte Bepreisung von CO2. Wenn Sie die Staaten gesehen haben, die in 50 Jahren klimatisch und darauf wirtschaftlich basierend in wirklich seriösen Schwierigkeiten sind, wenn das CO2 nicht oder wenn der Ausstoß des CO2s nicht in der Art und Weise gehandhabt wird, wie das ebenfalls vorgeschlagen wurde. Es sind unter anderem diese Staaten, die einer globalen CO2-Bepreisung nicht günstig gegenüberstehen werden, respektive. Und dort kommt dann eben wahrscheinlich auch die Befürchtung her, oder? Es braucht hier Geld. Und das Geld soll irgendwie anderswo herkommen. Also diesen Schritt haben wir noch nicht geschafft zwischen, was sind die Kosten, die ich verursache, wie können wir die Kosten sinnvollerweise verteilen und wie können wir sie so einsetzen, dass wir am einfachsten zum Ziel kommen. CO2-Bepreisung, wichtig für die Schweiz, ist nicht im SIF, steht nicht im Zentrum. Wir sind nicht zuständig, weder für Steuern noch für Abgaben. Das ist tatsächlich das Spielfeld der Politik und anderer Departemente. Wo setzen wir bei der Regulierung respektive bei den Rahmenbedingungen für den Finanzplatz den Schwerpunkt? Ich würde sagen, es wurde schon mehrfach gesagt, es ist Transparenz und es sind verwendbare Daten. In einem also TCFD, das wissen Sie, wir haben die Verpflichtung, dem Bundesrat hier eine Vorlage zu unterbreiten und das sieht gut aus. Wir haben hier auch im Kontext der Konzernverantwortungsinitiative sehr gute Lösungen gefunden und der Bundesrat wird sich in Kürze damit befassen, wie diese Vorlage umgesetzt werden soll. In der langen Frist müssen wir imstande sein, alle die Parameter, Sie erinnern sich gerade an diese Grafik, nicht mit diesen Strahlen, was sind alles Vektoren der Nachhaltigkeit, sei das die Übersäuerung der Ozeane, das ist nicht nur das CO2, sei das die Deforestation, sei das die Umrechnung in Klima, in Temperaturziele, Frischwasser, Biodiversität und dergleichen mehr. Idealerweise haben Sie Leute, die so ausgebildet sind, die entweder Kundenberatung so machen können, dass sie einem Kunden die ganze Dimension seiner Anlagen klar machen können, oder sie haben einen Knopf, auf den sie drücken können. Dann sagt der Kunde, ich interessiere mich hauptsächlich, ich weiß nicht für was, für Biodiversität. Dann drücken Sie auf den Kopf und sagen Sie, voilà, Ihr Portfolio sieht nach diesen Parametern unter diesen Erwartungen im Moment so aus. Wenn Sie das und das ändern, dann kommen Sie so heraus und dann können wir hier noch irgendwie einen Filter drüber legen über die politischen Entwicklungen und zu erwartenden internationalen Abkommen und dergleichen mehr. Wir sollten jenseits einer Debatte, was ist jetzt mit der Taxonomie und ist das bürokratisch und ist es aufwendig? Es ist bürokratisch und es ist aufwendig und wir wollen keine zusätzlichen überflüssigen Kosten in diesem Bereich verursachen. Wir wollen Klarheit, wir wollen es einfach, das bedingt Transparenz und das bedingt vor allem Verfügbarkeit von Daten und zwar im großen Stil. Keine Kammer, wir werden noch unser blaues Wunder erleben oder wir sind schon daran. Wir haben eines Tages gelernt, die Erde ist rund und sie ist auch nicht das Zentrum unseres Planetensystems. Was wir neu lernen ist, sie hat nicht nur in die Breite eine Dimension, sie hat auch in die Höhe eine Dimension. Wir werden nebst der unmittelbaren Erdnähe, die zum Transport geeignet ist, werden wir eine Explosion des Daseins im Orbit erfahren. Wir erleben im Moment eine Skalierbarkeit der Satellitentätigkeit, die vergleichbar ist mit dem Personalcomputer. Nicht alles wird kleiner, effizienter, es wird affordable, schlicht und einfach. Im Grunde genommen die Daten, die wir auch brauchen, zu holen und die Kommunikation sicherstellen, die Verwertung dieser Daten, das ist ein Vektor, den wir unbedingt in unsere Überlegungen einbeziehen müssen. Also Klarheit, möglichste Einfachheit, aber Faktenbasiertheit und Übersetzung in die relevanten Parameter. Und auf dieser Basis können Sie dann Ihre Entscheidungen treffen, nicht ob Sie über die lange Frist diskontieren oder ob Sie die kurze Frist diskontieren und was Sie Ihren Kunden raten. Und Sie haben ja eben wahrlich ein breites Spektrum von Erwartungen, das an Sie gestellt wird. Ich will noch ein Wort zum Ökosystem sagen. Es wurde auch hier schon alles gesagt. Wir müssen unbedingt das Angebot ausweiten. Die Steuerthemen sind uns bekannt. Verrechnungssteuer scheint auf gutem Weg zu sein. Sie haben auch sicher die Neuigkeiten über die Stempelsteuer vernommen. Auch das wird helfen. Wir sind dabei, den LKIF aufzusetzen. Der war gestern im Parlament, im Erstrat. Also an diesen Rahmenbedingungen arbeiten wir auch. Und ich möchte mit einem Appell aufhören oder mit einer Erkenntnis aus diesen Äußerungen, auch aus all dem, was vorher schon gesagt wurde. Wir tun gut daran in der Schweiz, wenn wir noch einmal zur Qualität unseres Finanzplatzes zurückgehen, dass wir, also der Bundespräsident hat das mir auf Französisch geschrieben, also wer auf Deutsch heißt es, wer ruht, der rostet oder wer rastet, der rostet. Wir können uns nicht darauf verlassen, auf den bestehenden Geschäftsmodellen weiterhin einfach die Renten abzuschöpfen. Wenn wir die Besten sein wollen und unseren Platz verteidigen wollen, den wir haben global, über die Grenzen hinweg, dann sind wir in dieser dauernden Zwiespalt, oder? Man strebt, um etwas zu erreichen, aber man kann sich dann nicht darauf richtig so ausruhen, was man erreicht hat. Wir müssen hier vorwärts gehen. Sie sind ganz wesentliche Vektoren in diesem Tun und von seitens des EFD und des SIF werden wir alles tun, um sie in den geschilderten Parametern zu unterstützen und hier ganz zum Anfang zurück, wir wollen mit Ihnen im engen Dialog sein, wir wollen Sie hören, wenn Sie Befürchtungen haben, melden Sie sich, wenn wir Lücken haben, wenn wir Sie an etwas hindern, was sinnvoll wäre, dann sagen Sie es uns. Wir können nur profitieren von diesem Austausch. Ich schließe hier und hoffe, dass wir die gröberen Details der Regulierungstätigkeit vielleicht noch auf dem Panel besprechen können. Dankeschön.
Vielen Dank, Frau Stoffel. Merci beaucoup et vous pouvez prendre place. Voilà, puisque vous participez à notre panel, j'aimerais peut-être aussi vous préciser, mesdames et messieurs, que si vous avez des questions à poser sur la stratégie de la Confédération, vous pouvez utiliser notre chat. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to switch to English for this panel discussion. Thank you for your understanding. It's the most convenient language for all. And it's a great pleasure for me to call Patrick Audier, Zeno Staub, and Thomas Velacote. Please come here on our scene, and we are going to open our discussion. Okay, very good, Monsieur Velacote. Mr. Staub, let's make now maybe presentations. Patrick Audier is senior partner of the Lombard Audier Group in Geneva. Zeno Staub here is CEO of Banque Vontobel in Zurich, and Thomas Velacote, director of the WWF, World Wildlife Fund in Switzerland. And of course, Daniela Stoffel is with us. We are going to discuss the role of finance in sustainable issues, and I would like to start by hearing the bankers. Patrick Audier, when we hear the presentation of Johan Rockström, for me, it's very scary. We have the impression we are the dinosaurs close to extinction. Do you think, can you imagine a world in which all his investments are sustainable? And I would ask you to take your microphone to talk to us. Thank you very much.
Well, first of all, I think that the presentation was impressive in many senses. First of all, it was completely fact-founded, and that's what State Secretary was mentioning is so important for the financial sector to have as at its disposal to make sure that it is effective. Second, it is clear that we are illustrating by this speech the limits that we have already transgressed. It's not a question of getting there, it's a question of having gone through already. And the third, which is more positive, is the fact that we can come back on some of them still today if we take the right actions. And that's where the financial sector is completely committed. It has not waited too long to realize that the fundamental fiduciary duty of the financial sector is to integrate those risks that were alluded to into their processes. And that's why I feel very comfortable with the fact that the financial sector, especially in Switzerland, with the right conditions, can do and manage its role very effectively.
Zeno Staub, thank you for taking your microphone. 1/3 of the investments in Switzerland are sustainable today, which means, of course, it's good, but we are far from the goal. How are we going to make it, having only 30% of sustainable investments today?
Yeah, when you want to go far, I think it's very important to clearly define where you want to go. So the question, I think the definitions we need is, does 100% sustainable mean that we have assets that support a net zero CO2 world? Or are 100% sustainable assets that adhere to a predefined criteria set on environment, social, and governance? I think these would be two completely different paths, and I would have completely different opinions on the trajectory towards these paths. If we limit ourselves to what we are implicitly always discussing today, which is CO2 neutrality, I would say it depends at the end on what markets start to price in as the risk of CO2 emission. And we as capital allocators do nothing else than support our clients in capital allocation decisions, and we do that based on price signals. And therefore, we would actually strongly, full-heartedly support CO2 pricing.
Okay, we're going to discuss on how to convince clients, what are the solutions, but I would like to hear you, Thomas Velacote. Do you have the impression that bankers are doing enough?
The financial sector is moving, and it's moving fast compared to where it was 3 or 4 years ago. So there is a lot happening internationally, which we're seeing. Is it moving fast enough? By no means, no. And I think the big problem is, and that relates to the measurability, and let's stay with CO2 for a moment. We need to align with the Paris Climate Accord. We need to align with the net zero goal. And as long as we don't have that trajectory measurable and report regularly against it to give clients the kind of information they need to take decisions, we have a big problem. So we need less words, and we need more actions and measurable actions and reporting.
But to have measurable actions, do we need more rules? Do we need interdictions, prohibition of certain investments, for example, in fossil energy?
People love discussing, do we need state intervention or do we need private sector action? I am so bored by that conversation, because at the speed we need to move, we need to come together, and we need it all. You know, we need clear framework conditions, we need private initiatives, but we need to come together, because the most effective environmental action comes when the private sector and state start moving together. So we just don't have the luxury of these kind of ideological debates. I'm sorry, but time is running out.
Can you tell us maybe what is the position of Switzerland compared to other European countries? Are we a good student? Are we doing enough?
You know, I don't think Switzerland's any worse than the rest of Europe, but I don't think it's any better in terms of its financial sector when it comes to sustainability. If I look at the third of supposedly sustainable investments in Switzerland, brackets, it's self-declared. We have to be very clear about that. So again, we need standards in order to make sure that where it says green on the package, there's actually green inside. But so I think with that third, you know, we're comparable with other markets. Now, the problem is, this is a hugely growing market for sustainable investment. It's one of the fastest growing markets worldwide. If Switzerland wants to position itself as a center for sustainable investment, which I think is a good thing to do from business side as well as the environment, if it wants to do that, then being average is simply not enough. But you need to show where things are going, and you need to show it in a measurable way, and you need to show it across the entire sector rather than just having a few nice products.
Who wants to react?
I would be happy to.
Yes.
I would be happy to. I'm sure that Zeno would as well. I think it's true that there's still a long way to go, but it's true also that the financial sector is on the path to bring its contribution to this transitions towards a more sustainable finance industry by definition and by necessity. First of all, as it was clearly demonstrated by Professor Ruckström before, it's not a matter of touching only certain types of sectors in industry. It touches us all. And in this respect, the risks that we are alluding to are risks that pertain in particular also to the financial sector. That's the first point. So we have to address them. The second is that I don't think the Swiss banks will need to see the others take a directions to make sure that they understand it's a competitiveness issue. We all know that it is a trend that is being taken overall in the world, but it is not because it is a trend that it is important. It is because it's a matter of doing our job correctly. If we want to invest or give credit to the right industries, to the right sectors, with the right understanding of the risks, and assume our fiduciary responsibility towards our clients, this is simply the way to do it. And in this respect, doing our job in a sustainable way is just doing our work correctly. And that's why it's a very good news to the financial sector.
The house is burning. We have to go fast.
Yeah, I fully agree that we all have to move. And just as an example, I mean, we are climate neutral since more than 10 years before everybody was talking about it. And I agree to that, but I would challenge you in 2 points. It's completely naive to expect that clients, asset owners, and the private sector move without policy action on this topic. We have only this problem because there is a market failure. And the market failure is a lack of property rights on a clean and healthy world. And the governments are the only people that can fix that. And then the market forces will sort it out with the same ingenuity that has created the wealth that has now become part of the problem that we have. So yes, private people need to run, private sectors need to act. I agree to all of that. But we need the framework that protects the unparalleled beauty and power of the market forces. And for that, we need property rights and prices. And otherwise, we will discuss for years and years. And beware the vote. I mean, I have made my opinion public, what I will vote on Sunday. But beware what the reaction will be to micromanagement of behavior.
Maybe a reaction of Daniela Stoffer, because, okay, the state has this responsibility, putting the framework, and do we really need this top-down structure and impulse?
I'm not saying it's a top-down situation, but it is correct. You know, if you have a public good and you have no property thereof, you have to assign the property rights, and it can be done via price, it can be done via a cap. Ideally, it should be redistributed directly to the under-average consumer. It's not done, nowhere. So yes, you're right.
So one of the games people love to play when it comes to sustainability is the blame game, where people point at each other and say, so the private sector says the state needs to act, the state say society needs to give us the mandate, society says business has to move. That does not get us there. We just don't have the time for that. We need to move on all those fronts. And yes, I would love a global carbon price. I would love it. But am I going to wait for that before we act? No way. Because I didn't say you did, but a lot of people do. A lot of people do. Listen to the large oil companies. They all say we are for a global carbon price. And by the way, until we get there, we're going to continue with business as usual. That is not how we're going to get there. You know, we can wait for perfect markets, or we can move forward and shape these markets, even if they're not perfect. And that needs all actors. It needs business, it needs the state, it needs civil society. And we need to stop pointing at who needs to do their homework. We need to get together and act fast.
Can I just react to that? I think this is completely compatible with what Zeno Stab was saying. He didn't say that we need the government to do something before we can do anything. He said we need other than simply our initiatives to make it happen. I think capital and the financial sector in general is one of the catalysts of this transition. The other catalysts are government and public authorities. as we say, bees don't send invoices. Okay, we need at one point in time to have an agreement. So those who can together get to that agreement need to gather together to get to these standards. We need the consumer to change their preferences and perhaps their behavior, and we need the companies to ensure that they adapt their business model. So without this cooperation, we simply can't go straight into a direction without having the safety of knowing in what direction we go. We need to do it together. And that was, I think, the point that was made. So there's no question about confrontation. It's a question about collaboration. Actually, SDG 17 is precisely talking about collaboration.
Let's talk about the challenge of private banks. You have clients. You have to convince your clients to change. How do you do this, Patrick Audier?
Well, first of all, I think you have to inform properly. And seeing a film or a presentation, I'm talking about the film because the film of Professor Ekström was just released through Netflix, by the way, which is an incredibly interesting film for that reason that it explains simply concepts that are extremely complicated. So information in this respect is complicated. It has to be transmitted in a fairly subtle way, and that's the number one. So if the financial sector does base its decision-making on facts and perhaps on the scientific framework, it can gradually be one of the vectors to inform correctly. Second is to educate, i.e. you have also to educate investors in general about the risks, because you can inform but not necessarily take action correctly if you just get the information. So you educate about the different types of risk. And the third, you can, as we say in English, usually you can hedge, i.e. you can engage. You can try to convince companies in which you do invest that capital will not flow that easily to those companies anymore if changes are not made. And that's for sure will have an impact on the behavior and the transformation of the business model of the companies.
Senor Stahl, how do your customers or clients react? Are they open to this discussion and information, or how do you manage with your clients?
First of all, I subscribe to everything that Pratik has said, and I think what we strongly believe in, that we have to take this one step further and make it an integrated part of the risk discussion and of the risk decision. As long as we leave sustainability in the corner of I educate you, I tell you, and I enforce judgment calls on your own behavioral choices, this will be a very difficult path. As soon as we come to the conviction that actually ESG criteria are a part of the business risk decision at the level of each and every single stock and single bond, we can again win, because we can work on a very common, simple goal, and I dare to say it very bluntly, make more money, because we also look at ESG. That's the only way, that's the only fully winning strategy, mainstreaming. We will have won the war when there are no more panels about sustainable investing.
What we do?
Yeah, I know, I just continue with my job.
Well, a panel is information too.
There is a point to be made for that. I think it was even today in the newspaper, there was a graph showing that investments in sustainable areas is less volatile. It actually gives you more certainty over time. And we might be looking to a future where there is maybe inflation and, heaven forbid, raising interest rates. That will cause, a shift in many areas. And it could well be that there is a case to be made for sustainable investments in the near future in the area of less volatility and more stability, more security.
Before we talk about solutions, I would like to hear you, Thomas Bellacote, on greenwashing. Is it possible today to say this investment is sustainable? It is 100% going in the right direction. We're doing the right thing. And how can we avoid this risk of greenwashing?
So I think it is a huge risk. If you have self-declaration, then you will have very different levels of quality behind that. If you asked producers of Swiss goods to self-declare if they are Swiss-made or not, then that would probably not be a good idea because you want to maintain a certain standard. So I think we need to go beyond everyone sort of saying, trust me, this is green, and actually make sure that what it says on the package is what you have inside. And that's where we can move forward in terms of developing standards. We don't need new standards. There are standards out there. We have science-based targets, things like that, which we can build on. But I think there's going to be more and more differentiation based on quality, because when everyone tries to jump on the bandwagon, then you can differentiate yourself by making sure you have good quality. So I think that's where we need to go here.
May I add just a comment on that? I agree with Thomas on that. I think quality will make the difference, but I think ultimately nobody's fool. You know, you cannot take as a first of all, you should not consider that sustainable investing has to do with products. As we tried to explain just before, it hasn't to do with product. It has to do with the investment process and the investment philosophy. Either you integrate the risk-return parameters correctly and then you become sustainable, as Secretary of State was saying, less volatile and perhaps longer-term oriented, or you don't do it and you take a risk of selling just a product short-term. First point. Second, I think, not to anticipate on your question, but I think we should be very careful not falling to the trap of an additional regulation for greenwashing. Actually, greenwashing has to do with selling, with trying to fool consumers. Okay, it has to do with investors' protection. It has to do with the loyalty or the due diligence or the fiduciary duty. If you take all those elements, they are already largely covered by existing laws. So let's be very careful we don't discuss, as unfortunately it's normal, because it's a risk and people try to understand that risk as well as they can. But let's be careful. This is only part and a very small part of the challenges that are open to the financial industry to be effective in investing sustainably.
Does the state is for you, is it a good thing that we don't have an additional regulation to avoid greenwashing?
Well, of course, FINMA is now intrigued by the question as well. So I share the view that we do not need to identify a problem and then say, oh, well, yes, we need more regulation. And I think it's done carefully to just look what we already have. And if you can subsume it on the fiduciary duty, just fine. It just needs to be seen, you know, because the National Bank and FINMA, both of them are ready to really look into sustainability in the area of risks. And we're really also from our side, we're advocating not only to look to risks of the past, risks we know well and risks that have been addressed due to the last financial crisis, but also to current and future risks and sustainability, the longevity of our planet risk definitely ranges among them. And maybe another one that is not yet fully addressed is cybersecurity. These are risks that need to be taken into consideration more and more.
Can I just really quickly, I didn't want to imply that it has to be the state who does this, right? I mean, whether you do something privately as a sector or by the state, what we care about is the impact that it has at the end of the day. And very often it's a combination of two, but it doesn't really matter as far as I'm concerned which way you go. But I think what we should do is we should move beyond declarations and be very clear about where do we want to be as a country, as a sector, 12 months down the line, 24 months down the line, because we're really measuring progress in terms of months, not years in this. And we should be very clear of what are we aiming for in terms of transparency, in terms of measurability, and how do we get there? Because then we can get together and do it together.
Well, let's talk about transparency. That's because this is one of the clues. How could we achieve transparency? Are there tools, efficient tools to help, of course, the bank sector, but also the companies, the real economy, to have more measurable tools? Zeno Staub.
I would be a full supporter of transparency, and we have also then, and I fully agree with you that the marketplace, the consumers, the state actors, through time, we will have different standards evolving. But I think there is a need to support, enforce, agree on clearly defined standards and regulations so that, for example, CO2 footprints of balance sheets should all be reported and disclosed in the same way, because otherwise it's like, accounting standards. We also came to the conclusion that in order to select companies on cash flows, we need accounting standards. When we have to price in CO2 risk of companies, it's helpful to us as investors if every company would report its CO2 footprint in a similar way. The only thing we should avoid is that we predefined kind of the end result of what is now sustainable or not. Just to give you an example, we should enforce transparency and standards on CO2 reporting, but should we predefine if a nuclear company is included in a CO2 neutral product or not?
We'll ask
If I ask
Daniela
my
Stoff.
German clients or my French clients, they may differ.
Do we have these standards? Are you working on these standards of transparency or not?
We are certainly not going to create a Swiss standard, that's for sure. And it has been said before, and we believe in that. There will be a standard that evolves. It is the market that finally will decide on a standard. What I'm worried about is that we do not have access to nearly enough data, or maybe we have the data, we don't use them. They're not standardized. And access is very limited. We haven't done very well during the pandemic, to take a recent example. And I don't really see much elan that would come out of the pandemic to say, oh, well, we haven't done well in this and this and that. Statistics was not really very good during the pandemics. Now we're working on the famous app that will allow us to travel, for your vaccinations. The app in itself, which is where we are very expert, it was done within 3 weeks. Now we all wait for the cantons to sort of transform the paperwork into QR code and then get informed that we can now download. So we're not there yet. We're not there yet, be it in harvesting the data, making them usable, and having a standardized use for them. None of them are really there.
So we should use technology. We have technology, Patrick Audier.
Yes, if I may back one step. First of all, we have this scientific framework. I think everybody understands that we're all in favor of having a scientific framework on which we can base ourselves. Then we can have data that are static data, and that would give us the Ist-Zustand, as we say in good English. What's the situation today? And from that situation, we still have to determine where are we going and where do we want to go? That's Thomas' argument, which is absolutely true. Where we need to progress is on the availability of those data. Yes, for the static purpose, but TCFD is a good example. The obligation to publish and to disclose a certain number on the climate issue itself is a first element of the 9 challenges of the boundaries. But the trajectory calculation is another one. If you want to know how effective you are, you need to know if you've chosen in the portfolio the companies that do contribute to the right trajectory the best or not. And that's something that is a bit more complex. And today we're seeing a lot of developments in this respect. Actually, the TCFD Commission has just come up with a report on the few methodologies that are the correct ones or the best ones to measure the trajectories in terms of temperature contribution of the different investment of a portfolio. And I think we should, for instance, in a country like Switzerland, come up quickly with an agreement between all of us, and that's an appeal I make on our own industry, to choose which is the best, together with our authorities, to have a benchmark. Where do we want to go through these methodologies about this data? And that could be replicated little by little in other aspects, such as biodiversity. We hear that the zero disappearance of species could be or nature expressed in another way could be an objective. Fine, as soon as we have it, we can apply the same process.
So you believe in some kind of bottom-up energy. Let's try to do something here in Switzerland with what we have before waiting for something international to come and resolve the problems.
The data have to be universal, of course. The data have to be universally accepted. Otherwise, we're also fooling ourselves. The methodology could be developed in a country like ours, with all the brains we have in the financial sector and in science combined, we could do it. because we have a very direct relationship with our government, it's even better implemented probably than in any other country.
But just as an example, what is happening in the trenches of investing, it's not a lack of information. The challenge is exactly as you have said, it's then the judgment. Because today, at the level of a stock or of a bond, you can buy yourself a service that gives you 300 ESG-specific data points for Unilever, Nestle, Roche, whatever, on average. 300 additional data points per stock. And then you look at your analyst and you ask him, is this now good or bad? Is this now ESG? At which level of ESG? Is the company on the right path or not? That's then the hard work. But a lot of information data points can actually are available and increasingly made available, but we all would profit if they would adhere to similar standards.
Is this a good direction? Is this the solution?
Well, it's a good direction that we develop these common standards, I agree. And we've been in the business for 30 years of developing global standards, such as the Forest Stewardship Council, Marine Stewardship Council, and so on. So we would very much favor that development. And let's not, data availability isn't perfect. Let's not wait for perfect data availability. Let's work with what we have and improve it as we go along. But I think there are two areas which we need to focus on specifically. And TCFD is really good, and let's go for it. It's a global standard, let's implement it. But there are two things we need to, I think, pay attention. One is, Patrick, what you mentioned is sort of trajectory. Where are we going as a financial sector, but also where are the companies going in which we invest? We co-founded a couple of years ago an initiative called Science-Based Targets Initiative that looks at how can, as an individual company, how can I align my goals for CO2 reduction to the Paris Climate Accord? And how do you do that on a sector basis? How do you do that globally? How do you do that as a specific company? That's not a WWF standard. We're just one of several players who co-founded that. And the number of companies doing that has doubled in the last year. So there's a real need and development towards setting science-based targets, which I think is a great initiative and helps us to get that data, not just about the status quo, but about where we're going and how fast. The second thing we need to do is look beyond climate, and you mentioned that before as well. And we need science-based targets, and Professor Rockström mentioned that we need science-based targets in other areas as well. And there's an initiative which was started a few days ago. Actually, it was launched, the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which looks at developing that kind of methodology for other nature-related risks.
For example?
For example, biodiversity-related risks.
Social risks?
Well, things like social risks are often the resulting risks from it. But for example, water stress, those kind of things which you can then look at. And again, we can develop common standards like that to ensure not everyone does it separately.
Yeah, I absolutely subscribe to that. You see, once you have a metrics, because you have defined the standard on which you want to have the metrics, I think the focusing of mind, and efforts, and methodologies, and the joint collaborations to get there is much easier. So nature, for instance, TNFD, is a great breakthrough if we can get it at the end of the year. The end of the year will be swamped by arguments linked to the net zero, how to get there quickly, and nobody will have a choice, plus the new objectives about nature. Remains all the other ones, because you mentioned social is a good one, but there are also other elements that we have to tackle.
Maybe let's take another example. Publica, the pension fund of the Confederation, has planned to use a climate stock exchange starting this year, I think. Do you know this project? Is this the good way to find solutions, Daniela Stoffel?
Yeah, well, pension funds and big institutional investors in Switzerland, they have guidelines, they have restrictions, and this is a discussion we still need to have. I don't think they have enough marge de maneuver for the time being. We would want to see them being more, being allowed to be more audacious, especially for those generations who will live in a net zero environment. This is, again, there is a trade-off, under current circumstances, what is certain is more important than what is in the future a possibility. So it's not fully reflected yet in the pension funds, this shift that needs to take place, and it is a discussion that we need to have with other competent authorities, but it is a problem that needs to be addressed.
The question of institutional investors, Patrick Odier and Zeno Staub, is this part of your reflection, discussion? Is it more difficult to inform and convince institutional investors?
Well, very often the institutional investors are considered to be the more professional, more sophisticated investors. So it's good if it's difficult to convince them, because it means that the dialogue will push us to be convincing enough and to be based on the right facts to make sure that the decision taken is the right one. But they do have specific needs and challenges. I give you just one, not to open a Pandora box, but just the use of index. I mean, the big asset owners, such as institutions in general, but the bigger one are usually in certain asset classes, if not in all, looking at indexing their portfolios. How do you go about decarbonizing an indexed portfolio? It's a huge issue, because the easy way to do it is just to take the largest position in the index, maybe the oil companies and perhaps a few others, and just throw them out. What do you do with doing this? You just don't assume your fiduciary responsibility as an institution. Just take much more risk. And probably you don't assume your fiduciary responsibility in addressing the decarbonization correctly, because some of the bigger ones could be the actor for changes that are the most efficient versus the small one that you will keep that are in very, very neat industries without having those damages, but will not make a difference.
That's when we realize it's not so easy. It's against your reflex,
It's a
the way
challenge.
you work.
It's a challenge. Technology, you ask about technology, ask us for data and methodologies to do it better. But it's a challenge we have to face together, not one against the other. Institutions are a great source of demand.
Yes, reactions?
Yeah, I mean, fully, again, subscribe to that. And some of the asset owners, especially, I mean, if you look at Nordic pension funds and also Australia, some of the most demanding sustainable investors in the world with very, very clear criteria and clear thinking. But again, as long as we think that sustainable investing needs judgment calls and we need to get kind of a for feature return, because pension funds are intermediaries as well. They will sit there and say, I cannot do that. So we only took off in the institutional sphere with solutions when we came and say, you don't have to forfeit return. We are happy to be measured against the index, but we will give you sustainability too. Otherwise, the big asset pools will not move.
Let's maybe ask us the question of the place of Switzerland in an international environment. Is Switzerland well positioned compared to other competitors in sustainable finance? What would you say? Maybe the bankers should answer this question, or Daniela Stoffel, are you analyzing the international environment? Is it easy for Switzerland to keep up and be ahead of this movement?
I think yes. I mean, if you look at the CO2 footprint, we're maybe no better, no worse than other countries. Independent of sustainable finance, Switzerland is a very sustainable country. We've always been, if you look at in the Middle Ages, when entrepreneurship developed, responsibility of the patron, how we treat our environment, how our political system is organized, we've always identified, these challenges and have organized our society accordingly. Sometimes with attributing property, sometimes just in a social contract. So from the mindset, from how we work, from how our state, our society, our culture works, yes, we are uniquely positioned, I would say, absolutely. And I'm very confident that we will take the leap forward also in financial services. Don't we?
Thomas Velacote, do you think Geneva can be the leader, or Geneva and Switzerland and the private banking sector in Switzerland can be a leader in sustainable finance?
Yes, it can if it wants to. It certainly can because it plays such an important role in terms of the global financial system. And I think it would be a very attractive role to play, and I think it would go very well with Switzerland's positioning worldwide. So I think there's all the opportunity there, but it's not going to happen automatically. If you want to position yourself as being a center of competence in a certain area, then you need to excel in that area. And not just a few players, but you need to make sure that the sector as a whole comes together. And that you don't have some black sheep tarnishing the reputation of the entire sector. That otherwise you completely destroy all the built-up reputation you have. And one of the advantages I think Switzerland has is that potentially the sector can move very fast because of the system we have of government and the corporations between private sector and public. So I think there is an opportunity there, but the world around us is not standing still and it's moving very fast. And as I say, if we want to position ourselves in this area, we have better set ourselves targets that we measure in months and not in years of how we get there.
Are there other European countries that are going faster that are examples for us?
Well, we heard earlier in the opening remarks about the position that others are playing in green bond markets. Now that's one segment, but this is sustainable investments, because they're growing so fast worldwide, is a segment that everyone is vying for. Everyone wants to position themselves. I mean, you get very few financial centers worldwide that don't want to be a center for sustainable development, not just in Europe, but also places like Singapore.
Zeno Stab, is the competition, the struggle really strong? And do you think you are in the good direction to win the game?
I would say the competition is always strong. I would fully support, the private sector can only get it wrong. We are gifted here when you look at sustainability in a broader context, how the state finances, pension funding, how this country energy mix, it's a natural home to be credible as a supplier. But and now I say something very provocative, perhaps also here in Geneva, we were also very privileged from a society base to sell asset protection globally, and we ran into some problems. So we have to do it right, professionally, and accept global competition, but I think we have a fair chance of winning.
It's interesting because, the willingness to be leader is probably a natural sickness for any entrepreneur or sector. But the fact is that we have to define how we would be winner. And I think in this respect, Switzerland is on the path to, again, integrate this new trend and this new necessity to adopt the climate-related, for instance, but the more sustainable, generally speaking, related risks into their investment philosophy. And the demonstration will only be by way of the successful development of the financial center. And if you look at the last few years, taking your example, a bit provocative as well, saying, through the crisis, I mean, if you look at the result, the transnationally wealth that is managed in Switzerland has continuously increased. That means that we can, in Switzerland, adapt and perhaps preempt some of those trends correctly. And I have absolutely no reason to believe that in the field of sustainable investing, we will do something differently. We have been the pioneer of microfinance. Everybody knows. We are probably one of the leaders in impact finance. Everybody knows. We are now strongly developing skill sets at the academic level in blended finance and development finance. Everybody knows. Now we're talking about the more traditional core investment business or credit, and I think it will happen as well. Why? Because we have, first of all, this convergence of all the actors. Look at the luck that we have to have someone like Thomas and his organization in Switzerland publishing, provoking, pushing, etc. We have many of these organizations that would never be anywhere else but in Switzerland. Actually, we have them all. So we would be completely fool not to take that challenge positively and make good use of that dialogue possibilities, including with our government. And that's why, sorry to make my speech, but that's why we are organizing this new platform that should bring Switzerland at the top of the agenda for the international community, which is called Building Bridges.
Building Bridges, and this event taking place in Geneva in November. Huh?
It's more than an event. It's a community, a summit, and a week of events.
Can I just, one little comment, which is, I think there is huge potential in Switzerland. I think we have to be careful we don't just look at the asset management side of things, because if we don't make sure that we don't at the same time extend credit to the coal sector worldwide, and that some of our banks are among the top lenders to coal companies, that again can tarnish what we're doing on the asset side. So we kind of need to look at the sector beyond just the asset management side or the wealth management side of things.
You're talking about the other big banks, general banks, banking sector?
Indeed, I'm talking about we need to look at both sides of the balance sheet rather than just one of them.
I'm turning to you, public, our audience, and would like to let you ask your questions. I would be happy to see a hand raised for a few questions. And I'm looking at our chat. I have not seen so many questions arriving, but please feel free. It's still time to ask questions to our panelists. I'm sure in this committee of association, there will be at least one question for either Daniel Stoffel, Confederation, or, okay, great. Thank you very much. I see a hand raised.
Good morning. My name is Frédéric Lelièvre from l'AGFI. Thanks very much for your insights in this panel. I'm coming back to the stamp duty issue and try and bring back some of the green bond market from Luxembourg to Switzerland. If the reform goes through and we effectively abandon, say, or scrap this stamp duty, how quickly this market could move or develop in Switzerland?
Good. A question from a journalist.
A good one.
A good one.
A good journalist and a good question.
Okay. Patrick Audier.
No, I think there's two issues. There's the issue of the stamp, which is something that, of course, is a hurdle on the way to transact more or issue more. And of course, anything that reduces the plate before it even exists is negative, and the financial sector continues to think that we should avoid those hurdles. How quickly could some of these businesses come back? If you take, for instance, the more important revision of the withholding tax, which we just discussed, I think it will be immediate, especially, immediate. We will have a great opportunity to proactively push the Swiss market in order to have these kinds of issues develop a market in Switzerland. That's absolutely sure. But it needs more than that. It means new issuers out of Switzerland leading perhaps the way, perhaps one day also our public authorities doing that, et cetera, et cetera. So this is one only of the aspects. Otherwise, the Swiss market is like every market, first and foremost, a local market for those kinds of issues.
Nothing to add.
Okay, is there another question in the audience? Yes, please.
This is working, yeah. Zeno, I liked your comment about the need for policy action. And so I also believe that regulation is a big part of the answer, and it's very easy to implement regulation to ban plastic or to introduce a carbon tax. The central element is probably carbon pricing and carbon tax. Where do we stand now? And what is the ultimate objective?
This is a question for Zeno Stauber.
For Daniela as well, because it's really a governmental question. But I mean,
more taxes, more regulation.
No, a price. A price. Yeah.
Yeah, the day you can apply carbon pricing and force companies.
Like the CEO law we're going to.
Yeah, the problem is as long as we can't do that step, we actually interfere with the market mechanisms in deciding what is good and what is bad and what is subsidized and what gets punished. And otherwise we would have a price on it, and then also consumer behaviors would obviously, there's
But
react to prices. But I'm
Do you
I'm not
accept-
the expert where the political discussion is. I have no
Okay,
clue.
but you accept the principle of taxes, regulation, and prices going up?
I never believed that markets exist in an environment without policy framework. I'm not in that camp of the economic.
But again, price has to do with this policy framework. I mean, it's not a regulation. It's recognizing that in producing or behaving in general, we are failing to include something that really exists and that is not built. As I said, bees don't send invoices, but they disappear. And perhaps if they sent invoices, they would not disappear as fast because we would take into consideration how to protect them better. Same thing for carbon. I was very interested to see a policy measure taking, I think it was, Thomas would know, but probably in Canada, where Canada announced 10 years ahead that the price of carbon will be at that height, which means an incentive for all those companies that have not yet realized that will have a major impact on their P&L to adjust and have the time to do it. That's a right policy environment.
Maybe I'll just add something. We need to internalize the costs which at the moment are being borne by us all. So it's the polluter pays principle, and we need much more of that. And that's a continuous journey on which we are. It's not like we haven't got it there. We've got it in different sectors in different ways, but it's just not very transparent, and it depends from country to country. That's a journey which we need to continue on, which is important. But let's also bear in mind, even if you don't have a carbon price in a certain sector, in a certain country, you now have 70% of the world economy covered by net zero pledges. So you know that 70% of the world economy is going to decarbonize by 2050 or 2060 in the case of China. So you have huge transition risks which are out there in terms of investing into carbon-intensive sectors at the moment. So just that declaration in itself bears a price which both companies as well as investors need to take into account, and which frankly too many are not doing at the moment. We were talking about pension funds beforehand. Talk to your pension fund about what transition risks they see in the portfolio they have, and you probably get blank stares.
Thank you very much for your question. Maybe one last short question and short answers. Yes.
Thank you. My name is Nicolette de Jonquière from All News. Mr. Vellacott made a comment about financing coal, but Switzerland is one of the largest hubs for fossil fuel trading. How does that reconcile with its objectives?
Good question. You wanted a short answer. That's no. It's exactly the sort of thing you need to go to if you want to position yourself as a country, as a leader in a certain sector. Then you need to ask those sort of questions, and you need to have answers to them.
Ladies and gentlemen, as a conclusion, I have asked our 4 participants on this panel to choose one photography, one illustration, one key message, and I would like Daniela Stoffel to comment the graphic she has chosen.
I chose the graphic representation of the SDGs because it hasn't been discussed today very broadly, but it is, to my mind, too narrow to focus on climate and too narrow to focus only on the environment. We have seen, and it has also been said by the professor, this is a challenge that we have to address as a whole. And this is the reason why we also talk about sustainable growth. So this represents for me the complexity and the goal that we have to work to.
Thomas Vellacott, we are going to see appearing the photography you have chosen.
So what do you see, the the picture on my left is a picture of Virunga National Park in Africa, Africa's oldest park. What you see on the right is an advertisement we placed in the Financial Times a few years ago, because the government in the DRC was giving out licenses to oil companies to explore in that national park. And I chose that because for a very long time we saw those two worlds as being separate from each other. That's where nature is, that's where finance is. Those two worlds are coming together because we're starting to realize that they have mutual effects on each other. And that's a role which we see very much for ourselves as well, in bringing those worlds together and developing solutions together.
Zeno Stauber.
Yeah, so this picture kind of what it presents to me, you know, I have the two girls, and when they will, I mean, they're already today old enough to ask me today, but then if they will ask me in 20 or 30 years, where have you been in that years when we were as Obama has said, the first generation to defeat poverty, slight setback by COVID, and the last generation to save the planet, what have you done? So I try to have an answer.
Thank you very much. Patrick Audier, the last illustration is yours.
For me, either we do it globally, and we're all concerned, and if we want to do it, there's only two options. We realize it or we don't, and it's night or day.
Thank you very much. Thank you to you four, and thank you. You deserve an applause. So I will let you please, Patrick Audier, Daniela Stoffel, Thomas Vellacott, and Zeno Stauber go to your seats. This is the last part of our event, and it will be in German. Wir kommen bald zum Ende unseres Vormittags. Ich würde gerne Marcel Rohner ans Rednerpult bieten. Marcel Rohner ist Vizepräsident der Genfer Bankengruppe ÜBP und abtretender Präsident der VHV, Vereinigung Schweizerischer Asset Manager und Vermögensverwaltungsbanken. Ab September, Sie werden Präsident der Schweizerischen Bankiervereinigung, des Dachverbands des Schweizer Finanzplatzes. Vielleicht eine Frage. Das ist heute Ihr letzter Auftritt als Präsident. Was hat Sie rückblickend geprägt in Ihrer Zeit als Präsident, Herr Rohner?
Ja gut, es waren 3 sehr spannende Jahre. Im Fokus stand der Zugang zu den internationalen Märkten. Bei diesem Thema haben wir leider nicht die gewünschten Fortschritte machen können, aber bleibt natürlich für uns als Exportindustrie absolut im Fokus, dass wir unsere Dienstleistungen in der ganzen Welt und auch in Europa anbieten können. Wir werden also dranbleiben. Das war ein wichtiges Dauerthema. Wir haben untereinander äußerst harmonisch zusammengearbeitet. Wir sind sehr näher an die ABPS herangerückt. VAV, ABPS sind sehr gut koordiniert heute. Das war wirklich eine sehr gute Entwicklung.
Und vielleicht Ihre größten Erwartungen als neuer Präsident der ASPB?
Meine größte Erwartung ist, realistische Erwartungen zu haben, was man als Industrieverband erreichen kann. Ich werde mich für einen kompetitiven Finanzplatz einsetzen. Wenn er wächst und prosperiert, dann schafft er am meisten Wert für alle Menschen in der Schweiz.
Marcel Rohner, ich überlasse Ihnen nur das Schlusswort unseres Vormittags. Und meine Damen und Herren, ich wünsche Ihnen einen sehr schönen Tag und danke Ihnen für Ihre Vornahme.
Nun habe ich das Privileg, 5 Minuten vor Lunch noch eine kleine Ansprache zu halten. Wir sind alle hungrig, ich will es nicht endlos in die Länge ziehen. Dass das Thema Nachhaltigkeit von zentraler Wichtigkeit ist, haben wir jetzt wirklich gesehen. Ich möchte nur 2, 3 zusammenfassende Kommentare machen zu den Diskussionen und interessanten Präsentationen, die wir gesehen haben. Die Fakten sind klar. Was passiert im Globus, hat uns Professor Rockström nochmals deutlich vor Augen geführt. Wenn wir uns im ganzen Nachhaltigkeitsbogen auf das Global Warming, die CO2-Emissionen jetzt mal fokussieren als vielleicht das absolut dringendste Thema in diesem Gebiet oder eines der absolut dringendsten Themen, dann scheint es mir klar, dass es eine Kombination sein wird von Verbot, was extreme Emission ist, Pricing, um die Marktmechanismen spielen zu lassen, aber auch Fokus und Technologie. Wenn wir die Schweiz anschauen und wir mal nach 80-20-Regeln schauen, oder, dann sind einfach 30% Verkehr und 20% ist Heizen. Also konzentrieren wir uns doch mal darauf und dann wird Technologie eben eine Lösung sein. Weltweit Nahrungsmittelproduktion und Verkehr sind die ganz großen Kontributoren, also werden wir uns, und Energieproduktion. Es kann nicht sein, dass man Technologie ausschließt von der Lösung, aber natürlich wird das beschleunigt, wenn die Preismechanismen stimmen. Also auch dann wird es eine Kombination sein müssen. Das Dilemma in der Schweiz ist, dass wir so klein sind in diesem Thema, mit 0,1% der Emissionen weltweit. Werden wir die Nadel nicht bewegen. Jetzt haben wir aber diesen Finanzplatz und der ist viel größer als 0,1%. Und das ist doch auch unsere Chance. Und jetzt ist die Frage, wie wir diese Chance nutzen. Und da gibt es eigentlich mal zwei Zutaten. Die eine ist das, was Zeno Staub schon gesagt hat. Die Risikoanalyse und die Beratung zum Thema Nachhaltigkeit und im Spezifischen zur CO2-Neutralität oder anvisierten Neutralität muss integrierter Teil einer jeden Beratung sein. Nur dann wird es funktionieren. Es ist nicht ein Nebenprodukt, es ist nicht ein Hinweis, wir haben das dann auch noch. Es ist Teil der Beratung für private und institutionelle Kunden. Das funktioniert, wenn wir Transparenz haben und darum sind Transparenzinitiativen so außerordentlich wichtig. Und das kann man jetzt verbinden mit dem, was Herr Wellacott gesagt hat zum Thema G3 und dass schon 3/4 der World Economy verpflichtet sind zu diesem Path und dass eigentlich das Thema breitest akzeptiert ist, die Methoden aber noch nicht so gut sind in der Regulierung, um es zu implementieren. Aber das ist doch genau die Chance. Wenn wir wirklich auf jedem Produkt wissen, was der CO2-Footprint ist, wenn ich bei jeder Offerte, die ich erhalte, wenn ich im Haus etwas umbaue, weiß, wie viel CO2-Footprint hat, wenn ich bei jeder Aktie weiß, was es ist, dann wird es immer mehr institutionelle und private geben, die simpel und einfach das nicht mehr wollen, wenn es zu viel ist. Genau weil sie wissen, wo es hingeht, weil das Risiko zunimmt, aber weil sie es auch einfach persönlich nicht wollen und bereit sind, den Preis zu bezahlen. Darum ist die Transparenz super entscheidend, aber sie wird nur funktionieren, wenn wir wirklich liefern in der Beratung unserer Kunden. Schlussendlich sind es die Kunden, die den Entscheid treffen, was sie tun und nicht wir. Und diese Kombination, glaube ich, die kann wirklich unseren Finanzplatz international zu den Spitzenreitern in diesem Thema bringen. Und wir müssen uns in allen Gremien, in denen wir auch international Einfluss nehmen können, zum Thema Transparenz absolut rigoros einsetzen. Weil das ist natürlich das, was wir auf globaler Basis brauchen, damit wir es für alle diese Vermögen, die wir hier in der Schweiz verwalten, auch wirklich umsetzen können. Damit bin ich am Schluss. Ich möchte mich ganz herzlich für die Teilnahme bedanken, bei allen hier im Auditorium und allen auch online, die noch hier sind. Ganz herzlichen Dank für die sehr kompetente Moderation an Nathalie Rondin. Ich danke allen Panel-Teilnehmern für ihre Beiträge, die sehr, sehr erhellend und instruktiv waren. Frau Staatssekretärin Stoffel, Patrick Odier, Zeno Staub und Herr Wellacott für diese wirklich interessante Diskussion. Und damit sind wir am Schluss. Ich freue mich, wenn nächstes Jahr beim nächsten Private Banking Day wieder so viele Teilnehmer dabei sind und ich wünsche Ihnen einen schönen Tag. Besten Dank.
and stop recording.